Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Wolverine 35 from 1990 in Marvel Comics, part 1 of Blood and Claws. 1990 was a propitious year for Marvel's mutant books. The line's flagship Uncanny X-Men saw a changeover in artist as longtime penciler Marc Silvestri passed the baton to up-and-coming superstar Jim Lee. But creatively speaking, it's possible that Silvestri got the better part of the deal, considering his next assignment after X-Men was the spin-off Wolverine, a book which had spent its first 2.5 years unmoored, jumping between different creators and defined by nothing so much as a dogged resistance to settling on a status quo. Despite its success, all but assured, in an age before chronic overexposure lessened the character's impact, Wolverine the comic book was desperately in need of stability and direction. Enter Larry Hama, still chugging along in the indefatigable G.I. Joe, but with an open schedule following the premature cancellation of Nth Man. With this context, the decision to pair Hama and Silvestri was a masterstroke. Two extraordinarily dependable creators with proven track records on Marvel's highest profile books, bashing out precisely the kinds of two-fisted men's adventure yarns that suited Logan's solo disposition. This is among my favorite work from both men, fleet-footed action stories set to the side of the X-Men, but also more closely integrated with the main X books than previous solo outings, which had cultivated a separate tone. Accordingly, the villain here is Lady Deathstrike, still working with the Reavers out of the Australian base they stole out from under the X-Men during the final stretch of Silvestri's run on Uncanny. X-Men associate Gateway is stuck doing the Reaver's bidding, albeit reluctantly, and it's down to his sense of humor that Lady Deathstrike appears above a rowboat on a fishing trip for Logan and Alpha Flight's Puck, right before all three are transported 60 years into the past to a Spanish town named Guernica in late April of 1937. It's there they run into an old friend named Ernest Hemingway. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Wolverine 36 from 1990 in Marvel Comics, part 2 of Blood and Claws. Wolverine and Puck's time travel adventure continues with the time-tossed heroes marooned in the Spanish Civil War, fighting alongside Ernest Hemingway. But they haven't arrived alone. Lady Deathstrike makes her entrance with a suitably creepy scene, captured and hung by German forces right before she tears the rope around her neck and makes the Germans an offer they can't refuse. Deathstrike is now determined to change the course of the war by handing over Wolverine's skeleton to the Nazi High Command, giving German forces a technological advantage heading into the beginning of the war and changing her personal family history in the bargain. Ultimately, as she relates, the goal is to save her father from his fate as a failed kamikaze pilot. The stakes here are notably different from most X-Men stories, concerned with the fighting of an actual war featuring actual people. Logan spends much of the issue, for instance, carrying a machine gun, not something he'd be particularly inclined to do in the modern era, but a necessity when facing down an entire bomber group of the Luftwaffe. The real appeal, however, is the team supreme of Marc Silvestri and Dan Green. This comic captures a critical moment in mainstream comics art, the tail end of 1990, right as Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld were beginning their great ascent, before the entire industry reoriented itself around their aesthetic. Accordingly, Green's inks here are still a continuation of the work he was producing with Silvestri for Uncanny X-Men. Lush spotted blacks and illustrative flourish, influenced as much by the up-and-coming hotshot Mike Mignola. Within the year, Mignola's influence would be washed away, however, replaced by an attempt to replicate the energy in Lee's work with Scott Williams, to say nothing of Liefeld's inking himself in the later run of New Mutants. Those pointedly artificial textures were soon to become state-of-the-art, and the line to beat for anyone who wanted to sell comics in the early 90s. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Wolverine number 37 from 1991 in Marvel Comics, part 3 of Blood and Claws. Wolverine and Puck's adventure in the Spanish Civil War comes to a close as Lady Deathstrike makes her move. Her alliance with the German forces comes to an end as her primary motive once again takes focus, killing Wolverine and taking back her father's life's work. Her fight with Wolverine here surely counts as one of their best battles, at least for a couple pages, before her arm is ripped off by the tread of a German tank. She's still quite dangerous, as she proves not just to the German tank crew she eviscerates, killing men who were meant to die much later in the war, changing historical records as fast as Donald Pierce can trace in the story's present. In any event, this surely counts as one of the greatest battles between the two nemeses. The tumultuous circumstances of their return to the present also drop them very briefly into the pages of Uncanny X-Men 204, where a Hama cheekily dances between panels of that issue's brutal fight. Ultimately, of course, Logan and Puck end up right where they left off, floating in Vancouver Harbor on a dinghy Bikini with their fishing gear none the worse for wear. Deathstrike has returned to Australia, badly damaged, but no less determined to destroy Wolverine. In between the action, we also see the origins of two more of Wolverine's most enduring enemies, LCD and Albert, robots built by Pierce for the purpose of assassinating the X-Man, who happen to develop minds of their own along the way. This is still the early days of Larry Hama's run on the character, and he's still setting out chits that won't be called in for months and years. Long after Silvestri leaves, he'll still be working with a number of artists, most notably Adam Kubert, laying down 7 years of track on his way to becoming arguably the definitive writer of solo Wolverine stories. As for Silvestri, although this run of Wolverine is an unquestioned highlight of his career, his style would continue to change and shift through to the early days of his tenure at Image and the regrettably over-rendered Cyberforce. Eventually, he'd return to something more resembling the heavy spotted blacks and moody mise-en-scene of this run in the pages of The Darkness.